I want to thank you again for joining me in this next study in the book of Isaiah. As many of you know, it has been several weeks now since we've had this study. We took a break over the holidays, and now that we're back, we're ready to resume this study. Uh, to do so, what I'd like to do now is to step back and review a little bit so we can kind of hit the ground running. And if you will, therefore, please turn back to chapter 13 of the book of Isaiah, and we're going to begin this next section, or we're looking at this next section, which has to do with the destruction of the nations. Chapters 13 through 23 is that destruction of the nations. Now, we had gotten to chapter 19, but again, I want to kind of go back and hit the ground running, pick up where we were there with Egypt, and then resume that study as we now move ahead in that study together. The first nation that was spoken against was that of Babylon, and that's in chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 14 and verse 23. There were 5 basic lessons that we learn in God's judgment against these nations. First of all, that God would not tolerate sin. Number 2, that God is Lord of the whole earth. We see his authority as that which extends to all. All are going to have to answer to God. Number 3, we learn the lesson that God will punish those who oppress his people. Many of these that we're looking at are people with whom Judah had had trouble for some time before. Number 4, we also see that God is concerned with the sins of the entire world. If God did not care, there would be no steps taken to deal with the sins of all of those. And so there again, indeed, is another lesson that we can learn from that. And then number 5, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the one that we just saw, God cares for the people of all nations. We see prophets sent to many people. We see God had entered into a covenant relationship with so many people given the opportunity to have this relationship with God, and yet we see judgment that came upon them because of their unwillingness to seek God and to follow his way. Well, the destruction of Babylon was addressed specifically in chapter 13, verses 17 through 22. And we know historically this came at the hand of the Medo-Persians. Now, some of these judgments against these nations are told to happen in just a short period of time. And some of these we know historically it was some time before that judgment was indeed passed on. That's the case here. Isaiah began prophesying about 740 BC, and as we're moving along, we're going to see here in just a moment that we're down to about 715 BC as Isaiah was working. But the prophecy here against Babylon was basically fulfilled at the hand of the Medo-Persians, beginning about 539 BC with the beginning of Cyrus, that Medo-Persian king. Secondly, and this is in chapter 14, verses 24 through 27, Assyria was the next to be spoken of in the sense of judgment. Isaiah lived to see the destruction of Assyria when Sennacherib went down. Roughly about 612 BC is when that occurred, not looking at the literal date there. But here was something again that Isaiah likely saw as it relates to this judgment. The third of the nations that were spoken of to receive God's judgment was Philistia. And this was recorded in chapter 14, verses 28 through 32. Again, we're looking at judgment being given against those and spoken on those who had troubled Judah. Well, this judgment was to begin about 715 BC. Judah may have been influenced, as they were by so many of the nations around them. Judah may have been influenced to enter into a sense of an alliance with these people. They were told not to do so, as God promised to bring his judgment down on those that they attempted to look to for aid largely against Assyria at some point. The fourth nation to whom judgment is spoken is Moab, and that's in chapters 14 through 16. Remember that the Moabites were descendants of Lot when Lot and his two daughters escaped Sodom and Gomorrah. You see, the two daughters got Lot drunk and basically had sexual relations with him, and the result was the Ammonites and the Moabites. And so there's the background of the people that we're looking at. Genesis chapter 19, verses 36 and 37. Well, in the context there of chapters 14 through 16, you find 8 cities of Moab that are addressed within 4 verses of text. Here again was a nation that could have turned to God, but they chose instead to turn to pride and arrogance and wrath and lies. Zephaniah likewise wrote of this destruction in Zechariah chapter 2, verse 9. And I find it somewhat ironic in the comparison that is made. Zechariah said that these 8 cities of Moab would be as Sodom and Gomorrah in their destruction. The 5th nation to be addressed in this judgment was Damascus, and that was in chapter 17 of the book of Isaiah. Damascus is said to be the oldest continually inhabited country or city in the world. It was the capital of Syria. Now remember when we were looking back at chapter 7 and we saw the message to Ahaz, in which we found the great messianic prophecy of Isaiah 7:14. As it related to the Syro-Ephraimitic war, remember that Israel and Damascus, Syria, was exerting pressure on Ahaz to form an alliance with them against Assyria. As that did not occur, remember that these two nations wanted to depose Ahaz and put in a puppet king that would rule as they wanted. If that occurred, remember that would have broken the Davidic line referenced in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God told David that he would keep that Davidic line pure through which the king would come. This sign was given to Ahaz there in Isaiah chapter 7. And that sign, in my opinion, at least partially included that descendant of David would come through. Isaiah spoke of Emmanuel, referring to God with us. The one that had been promised, Genesis 49:10, the scepter would not depart from Judah until the one whose it is, the one to whom it belonged, would come. And in that sense, if that messianic line were to reach its fulfillment as it relates to prophecy, as Ahaz was promised, then Ahaz would stay in place. He would not be removed. He would not be taken away. And so that should have been somewhat of a comforting message for him. The judgment that was spoken of against Damascus was portrayed as a reaper gathering standing grain. The cause of that judgment was because they had forgotten God. Verses 10 and 11 of chapter 17. And then in chapter 18, we move to our 6th nation that is spoken of in judgment, and that is Ethiopia or Cush. Again, we're looking at countries that would be temptations for Judah to form alliances. Judah had a trust problem regarding God. They had for some time. And rather than just allow God to deal with their situations, they chose rather to attempt to form alliances with these other countries. Here again, Judah was warned in this message not to do so with Ethiopia or Cush, as they're called both in this sense. They were told don't form alliances with them because God is going to punish them in his own time. The language is somewhat interesting in verses 4 through 7 of Isaiah 18, and that is that God would prune away the evil influences in the world, cutting them off in that sense of pruning. Judgment is to come. Well, this brings us to chapter 19, and here is where we're going to continue the study that we had begun. Now we're looking at the judgment to come against Egypt. Now, we had looked at verses 1 through 4, but I wanted to back up again and hit the ground running. I appreciate your patience as we looked at this review, but I think it's important for us to get back and to reconnect to the flow that we've seen through these messages. So let's look, if you will, to Isaiah chapter 19. And let's, in just a few moments, read verses 1 through 4 again as we look at the internal strife that is spoken of as that which is going to bring Isaiah down. Well, chapters 19 and 20 both contain God's messages against Egypt. The leaders of Judah, again, were tempted to look to Egypt for deliverance. This had not been the first time. It was a common temptation for them, a continual temptation for them to do so. Again, because they did not trust in God, they were looking to these other nations, and these other nations were again powerful, excuse me, in their day and in their own way. We're looking at Egypt that had long been seen as powerful. Remember all of the chariots that were depicted, and that was their military, the cavalry, if you would, of their day. You had a large number of chariots, you had a large number of troops, and you had countries that dominated others for so long. And what's being said here is that these nations were going to go down. Now, when we look at some of these others, for example, when you look at Assyria and they're being brought down, God used the Babylonians to bring them down, an outside army that was done to do so. When God pronounced his judgment against Babylon, he used Medo-Persia to bring them down militarily. Medo-Persia is going to fall to Greece, and Greece is going to fall to Rome. But there's an interesting point here, and there's a similarity between Egypt and Rome as it related to their demise. It was not going to be through external forces that it was going to occur. There were going to be internal problems, internal decay and corruption and infighting that basically allowed them to collapse within themselves. Remember that God saying he was going to do something is often characterized in God allowing it to happen. God does not step on somebody's free moral agency. He does not remove the ability for people to choose. But what's going to happen here with Egypt is going to be self-inflicted. But because God uses it and allows it, it's indicated as God bringing that judgment against these people. Isaiah warned Judah that the problems that they had with Assyria were not going to be resolved through an Egyptian alliance. And as he says, as a matter of fact, Egypt is going to go down themselves as they're going to fall. As we look at the language that is used here, again, the message that Isaiah is attempting to get Judah to see with these pronouncements of judgment against these foreign countries is that Judah should trust God through all of this as it relates to their care. So let's now look. You got God's judgment against Egypt in verses 1 through 15 of chapter 19. Let's look at the internal strife that's spoken of here now in chapter 19, verses 1 through 4. The burden against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. I will set Egyptians against Egyptians. Everyone will fight against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The spirit of Egypt will fall in its midst. I will destroy their counsel, and they will consult the idols and the charmers, the mediums and the sorcerers. And the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, says the Lord of hosts. It is no mistake that we see language that should have been very familiar to Egypt. I want us to go all the way back to the time when God's people were in captivity, in bondage in Egypt. Remember, as the book of Exodus opens, God's people that had been raised to a place of prominence at the end of the book of Genesis grew large in number. But then a Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph, didn't have that relationship, didn't understand the conditions that were given for God's people being placed in Goshen at the work of Joseph and what Joseph was able to accomplish. When it was seen that they had grown large in number, fulfilling the great nation promise given to Abraham so long before, they were brought under bondage to be controlled. Remember that Egypt was probably concerned that this large number of people might be wooed over by an enemy and used against them. So they brought them under control. They tried to control their childbirth. They tried to control their numbers, and all of that was not seen. God providentially working with his people to the point that God, through the leadership of Moses, was eventually able to secure the freedom of Egypt, start them toward Sinai, and then move them toward the promised land to fulfill also the land promise given to Abraham. We remember all of that historically. But the point that I'm making here is I want us to understand the language that is very similar to what we see being spoken of. First of all, God is depicted here in verse 1 as riding on a swift cloud. He's using language here that would be very familiar to the psalmist. If you will, please look at Psalm 104 and verse 3. Psalm 104 and verse 3. There I read, "He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters, who makes the cloud his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind." Verse 4, "Who makes his angel spirits his ministers a flame of fire." Again, very similar language that is used to depict the power and the might of God. Ancient peoples, though, also had an understanding of these things. And when we look at the writings, when we look at what's been discovered archaeologically in the works of these other places, their deities riding on clouds is something that was often depicted about their own gods. And so a very similar language is used here. We also see here in our text that the idols of Egypt would tremble at his presence. Let's think back again to the 10 plagues regarding Moses and Pharaoh and the Egyptians. When you look at those 10 plagues were judgments or were showing God's mastery over the idols, the gods of Egypt. And so again, the idols of Egypt would tremble. This is not going all the way back to that time. This is just using somewhat similar language to describe what is going to happen when Egypt does go down regarding the judgment of God here. Egypt had some 75 gods that they served in the form of these idols. And a question that we could ask here is, did they not learn from the past? Here you're looking at those who again claim supremacy. They claim that their own deities were more powerful than God, if not in word, then in deed and in practice. They continued to worship these idols, and they continued to put their confidence and their trust in these idols, talking about Egypt here, when in reality they had been shown generations before the power of God and his mastery over these idols. In verse 2, here's what's somewhat interesting, and that is that God's message for these idolaters would be that he would incite Egyptians against Egyptians. Notice there, this judgment is not seen in an external force coming in and manifesting its power over Egypt and bringing Egypt down. No, Egypt is going to decay internally. They're going to turn against each other. According to one historian, and commentator James Henry Breasted. This was fulfilled historically in the struggles of the Egyptian alliances with each other, and that brought about that internal demise. Rome fell in the same way. There are those who say that Rome fell without a shot being fired of an external force against Rome. Rome corrupted from within. They became so sinful and so corrupt that they fell. I do not want to be a naysayer, but I see a very real threat that our country, the USA, is on a path to do that very thing. We're looking at more and more who are elevating the temporal above God, who are denying the existence of God, who are even challenging those who claim to believe in God. It may well be that persecution may come again, like we haven't seen in our own lifetime. I hope that's not the case. I hope that does not happen. But we need to again understand that we cannot trust in America to save ourselves, as that will not happen. The only way that America will avoid, that the USA will avoid that which has happened to so many nations headed down a similar path, is we have to trust in God. As Christians today, we must put our own trust in God to help us through the difficult days that may be ahead. Verse 3 that we just read. This would demoralize the Egyptians. In desperation, they would turn to their idols, ghosts of the dead, mediums, and spiritualists, as Saul had done under very similar circumstances. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 4 through 20 is something to look at for that point. Again, verse 4, look at the similar language of what happened during the Exodus, but see it reversed regarding the Egyptians. They would be delivered into the hands of a cruel master. When you look at the Israelites who raised their voice to God for delivery, remember they were placed under the work of cruel taskmasters. Remember at one point their straw was taken away. I want you to imagine somebody cracking a whip for the Israelites to continue working and to stay at work and to produce even more. Here, Egypt is going to fall to these same cruel masters. Now, we're not certain who this was as it relates to the literal fulfillment of this passage. Willis, a commentator, indicated that it could have been two kings of Assyria, Sargon in 711 BC or Sennacherib in 701 BC. Homer Haley, in his commentary on Isaiah, stated, it is possible that in verse 4 the Lord is speaking not of one individual, but of the sum of cruel foreign kings who were to rule over the land. But those foreign kings were only able to ruin because God allowed or brought the internal strife that would result in the decay of Egypt, making them easy prey for someone else. So not only would they have internal strife that would bring about their demise, the next section, and that's verses 5 through 10 of our text, speaks of the economic collapse that would be seen. Read with me, please. The waters will fail from the sea, and the river will be wasted and dried up. The rivers will turn foul. The brooks of defense will be emptied and dried up. The reeds and rushes will wither. The papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown by the river will wither, be driven away, and will be no more. The fishermen also will mourn. All those will lament who cast hooks into the river, and they will languish who spreads nets on the waters. Moreover, those who work in fine flax and those who weave fine fabric will be ashamed, and its foundations will be broken. All who make wages will be troubled of soul. When you look at verses 5 through 9, This is a section that vividly describes the economic collapse resulting from a lack of water in the Nile. Specifically, there's verses 5 through 6. Let's realize that this was indeed the paradise for them, a garden for them. And that's the Nile Delta region. Everything rose and fell as it related to quality of life based on what happened with the Nile River. I was privileged to travel to Tanzania, to Africa on many occasions. And on at least 2 of those trips, our route took us over this region. I would fly into Amsterdam, and then we would fly to Africa. And I can remember looking down from my window in the plane and seeing something that was very interesting as it brought it to my mind with a visual aid. And that was, I can remember looking down and seeing only blue beneath me. And I then thought, well, I'm flying over the Mediterranean Sea. And that was depicted. And then just below that Mediterranean Sea, I saw vast areas of brown. And that was the desert that was seen. But then I saw that small green patch that's known as the Nile Delta region. And that was what was the paradise, again, the garden for them of that area. Remember when Joseph brought about the bringing of God's people down to Egypt, and they were placed in the land of Goshen. They were given the finest of lands. And that Nile Delta region, often when it overflowed, and you see everything that rose and fell through the benefit, the provision of the Nile Delta. You're looking at an agricultural society that oftentimes would have portrayed the Nile as a god. That is the way people think. But here you're looking at part of the judgment that is to come on Egypt is going to be the hardship that is going to come as the Nile, in essence, dries up. Now, no, it never dried up. The Nile is still there. But you're looking at judgment that comes that is seen in the difficulty of this time. People in all lines of work are going to suffer hardship. Egypt was dependent upon those Nile floods and that overflow. Cairo only receives about 2 inches of rain annually. Sand dunes and dry, stony plains comprise 90% of Egypt's land area. Oswalt, in his commentary, said, without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. And then lastly, we look here at verse 10 and see this final point of destruction. We have just a couple of minutes left. And its foundations will be broken. All who make wages will be troubled of soil. One translation said the pillars, the foundations of Egypt would be crushed. That may very well refer to the idols and the obelisks, all those things that were erected by kings and nobles throughout the land. You're looking there, the pyramids were there in that day. You're looking here, though, at all of those things that are characteristic and are designed to pay homage to what they portrayed to be their gods. All of those things would be brought down. Whether it occurred physically or whether this was just a symbolic reference, you're seeing all of the things that Egypt perceived regarding their greatness, these idols, these gods throughout all the land. All of that's going to be taken down, and they're going to suffer hardship. Haley sees this as being symbolic for honesty and virtue, piety and goodness. So whether it was physical or whether it referred to attitudes, we do see them coming down. It would be the working class also spoken of here. Their entire economy, all of things are spoken of. So again, whether we're looking at something symbolic or whether we're looking at something literal, language is used here to show, number one, that we saw in verses 1 through 4, You're going to see the internal decay that brought about their fall. And likewise, we're going to see their economic hardship that is going to be seen. Lord willing, next week, we'll pick up by looking at the political collapse in verses 11 through 15. Thank you again for joining us in this study. We will be continuing these now week by week as we go a little bit more regularly. Look forward to our next study together. And until then, God bless you.